Yes, welcome back to the afternoon session of Sunday for the May Gathering 2020. I want to introduce the talk by David Moody, but just for you to know, David, because of the lock-in we're having, David could not come over, so we pre-recorded David's talk. And after the talk, he will zoom in and we will do question and answers with him and talk a bit with him. So that his talk is about half an hour, and then we have about an hour to discuss and question with him. And of course, as an audience, you're more than free to put questions. Now, David Moody is, for those who have been to the May gatherings, he's almost every other year he gives a talk. Because he has been writing prolifically about Krishnamurti. He wrote one book about an uncommon collaboration of the collaboration between Krishnamurti and David Bohm. He also wrote a book about his experiences at the Oak Grove School. He was a director at a certain time at the Oak Grove School, and he was a teacher. And in his capacity, he interacted a lot with Krishnamurti. And he wrote about his experiences at the school. The title of that book was called The Unconditioned Mind. And then today he's going to talk about his latest book, which is called Krishnamurti in America. And that's interesting. Also yesterday when Mark Lee presented his book, there's this big gap in biographies. You have biographies of from the Indian perspective, from the European perspective, but there's not really a biography of the American perspective yet. And I think David is trying to fill that gap by dedicating a whole volume on Krishnamurti in America. Now, without further ado, we're going to start the video of David Moody and then see you at the other side of the video.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation. I'm going to be talking today about the story of Krishnamurti's life in the United States and about my new biography of him, which is called Krishnamurti in America. I'd like to explain what is interesting and unusual about my book and why I felt that it really needed to be written. I'm going to assume that most of you, or many of you, already know at least a little bit about Krishnamurti's life, such as the way he was raised in the embrace of the Theosophical Society, where they declared that he was going to become the next, what they called, world teacher. And you may also know that Krishnamurti had a younger brother named Nityananda. They called him Nitya. And these two brothers were very close. They lived together and traveled together all through their teens and well into their 20s. But when Nitya was about 22 years old, he was diagnosed with having tuberculosis. And after that, a great deal of the activity of the two brothers was oriented around finding the best doctors and the best possible care for Nitya. And at that time, it was generally believed that one of the best things you could do for someone with tuberculosis was to have them be in the best possible climate. And that was understood at that time to mean a place where the air was rather dry and very clean, such as you might find in certain mountain settings. And so that's the situation that first brought Krishnamurti to the United States, because he had been told that there was a valley in Southern California that had a climate that was very conducive to the treatment of people with tuberculosis. And that is why Krishnamurti and Nitya came to the Ojai Valley in Southern California in 1922, when he was 27 years old and Nitya was 24. And the two brothers had traveled together a great deal in Europe and India and Australia, but this was the first time that either one of them had been in North America. And so then what happened after the brothers arrived in Ojai was kind of unexpected. First of all, they both fell in love with the Ojai Valley. They loved the natural beauty and what they perceived as the spiritual atmosphere of the place. And they basically made Ojai into their home. And then, in addition, just a few weeks after they arrived here, Krishnamurti underwent a rather strange 3-day experience, an episode that lasted for 3 days with several very unusual symptoms, both physical and psychological symptoms. He was in a great deal of pain, a lot of pain in his head, the back of his head and his neck, and he was only semi-conscious much of the time. And at the end of the 3 days, he felt a sense of deep union with all of life. And all of this marked a great turning point in Krishnamurti's life, because coming to America was the first time in many years that he had been outside of the constant influence of the Theosophical Society. And the 3-day episode really marked the beginning of his sense of independence. 7 years later, in 1929, he broke away from the Theosophical Society entirely. But that event was really the culmination of a process that had been set in motion by coming here. So this is one example of what is new and different about my biography of Krishnamurti, because previous biographies have discussed the 3-day experience, and they, of course, have discussed why and how Krishnamurti broke away from the Theosophical Society. But my book shows how these two events are related to one another. It shows that there's a pattern to the sequence of events, and that coming to America was an important part of Krishnamurti's development. In fact, it may have been crucial to the development of his independence of mind. And another very important part of Krishnamurti's life in America has to do with his business partner, Rajagopal, and with a young American woman named Rosalind, who married Rajagopal in 1927. And Rajagopal was in charge of all of the practical aspects of Krishnamurti's public talks, which meant arranging the travel and arranging for the talks to be transcribed and edited, and managing all of the donations that were given on behalf of Krishnamurti's work. And for many years, the two men got along reasonably well. There were some arguments and even some antagonism, but on the whole, Rajagopal scheduled the public talks, and he arranged for them to be edited and published, and he managed all of the business side of Krishnamurti's work. And so this arrangement worked reasonably well for about 25 years, from roughly the 1929 until a few years after the end of World War II. But during the 1950s, the relationship kind of began to fall apart. And during the 1960s, it really became very contentious. So that ultimately in 1968, Krishnamurti felt he had to separate and disassociate from Rajagopal completely. And that is what led to the formation of the Krishnamurti Foundation of America in 1969. But that was not the end of the story, not by any means, because it turned out that the Krishnamurti Foundation had to get involved in a series of lawsuits with Rajagopal and with the organization that Rajagopal had created, which was called QUINC. That was an acronym for Krishnamurti Writings Incorporated. And all of this is something that Krishnamurti went to great lengths to try to avoid. He tried for many years to resolve his differences with Rajagopal, and he was deeply reluctant to get involved in any lawsuits. But in the end, it turned out to be something that was just unavoidable and even inevitable. Now, I think that all of this material, this sequence of events, has to be concerning to anyone who's interested in Krishnamurti and his teaching, because there's a certain relationship between the man and his work, between Krishnamurti personally and his philosophy. His teaching has a great deal to say about relationship, about human relationship, and especially about conflict in relationship. He goes into great detail about the origins of conflict in relationship and the possibility of another way of living that would be more harmonious. And yet, here in his own personal life, one of the most important and long-lasting relationships of his entire life turned into something very conflicted and even into a series of lawsuits. So students of his teachings kind of have to wonder, what does it mean that he talks so much about living without conflict, and yet here in his own life there was a very significant conflict? You might wonder, did he have difficulties like this with other people, or was it mainly just with Rajagopal? And did this represent some kind of contradiction with the teachings, or just in general, how did it all fit together? So I have to say I felt a tremendous responsibility in writing about all of this, because it was something that had to be communicated very accurately and completely objectively, because this was material that his previous biographers really hadn't gone anywhere near, or rather his authorized biographer, Mary Lutchens, she dealt with a little bit of this material, but she did so kind of from a distance and without going into any detail and without examining any of the psychological dimensions of it. And Pupul Jayakar, who also wrote another major biography of Krishnamurti, her book emphasizes his life in India and really hardly mentions the problems with Rajagopal at all. And it's very sensitive material. If the story is not told properly, it could affect the way people feel about Krishnamurti and his teachings. So I felt a tremendous responsibility to tell the story accurately and completely, and let readers really understand firsthand what took place and why Krishnamurti acted in the way he did. And it's an essential piece of his life that has really not been told before. Now, the story of Rajagopal and why Krishnamurti came into conflict with him is, the story is complex and intricate and meaningful and psychological all by itself, but it happens to be just one thread or one theme in an even more complex sequence of events, because it happens that Krishnamurti also had a very meaningful and intimate romantic relationship with Rosalind, who was the wife of Rajagopal. And Rajagopal and Rosalind had stopped living together as man and wife, but they were still legally married. And Krishnamurti, to some extent, kind of stepped into that void. And this was not generally known during Krishnamurti's lifetime. But Rosalind and Rajagopal had a daughter named Radha. Her married name was Radha Sloss. And just a year or two after Krishnamurti died, Radha published a book whose main theme was to expose and describe her mother's romantic and sexual relationship with Krishnamurti. Radha's book was called Lives in the Shadow with J. Krishnamurti, and she selected that title to contrast it with the first memoir that had been written about Krishnamurti written by Emily Lutchens, who was the mother of Krishnamurti's biographer, Mary Lutchens. Emily Lutchens' memoir was very favorable in the way it treated Krishnamurti, and her book was called Candles in the Sun. So Radha Sloss named her book Lives in the Shadow, to contrast it with Candles in the Sun. Now, when Radha's book first appeared, it came as kind of a shock to many people, because a lot of people had kind of assumed or taken it for granted that Krishnamurti had always been celibate. He was never married, and some people projected upon him the image of a saint-like or spiritual figure, someone who might take no interest in sex or even actively avoid it. And so for some people it was surprising and even disturbing to find out that Krishnamurti had been involved in that way with any woman at all, much less a relationship that went on for 15 or 20 years. But then, on top of that, Rosalind was not just any woman that Krishnamurti happened to know. She was the wife of his business partner, Rajagopal. And so that adds another dimension to that relationship as well. So these three people were intertwined by marriage and by a long-standing affair and by the scheduling and publication of Krishnamurti's talks and the financial management of his work. It was a very intricate network of relationships, and Krishnamurti's role in it looks kind of questionable to some people. Now, Radha's book told the story of Krishnamurti's relationship with her mother from the perspective of Rosalind, which told a great deal, but also left out a great deal. And now we know a lot more what actually took place. And that is partly because of the publication of the memoirs of Mary Zimbalist, who lived with Krishnamurti for the last 20 years of his life. And Mary's memoirs only began to be published online in 2015, and they didn't come out in book form until 2018. So partly from Mary Zimbalist and partly through some other sources, it's now possible to put together a much more full and complete picture of what actually happened between Krishnamurti and Rosalind. So this is another story which has never really been properly told before. And this is the first time that you can really see all the pieces of the puzzle and how they all fit together. So that was another major objective of my book. Now, Krishnamurti's life cannot really be understood apart from his teachings. So I tried to examine the evolution and development of the teachings over the course of several decades. And if you look at the teachings from an historical perspective, you can see that looking at it in that way helps give some insight into the meaning of what he was trying to communicate. For example, during the 1970s and 1980s, Krishnamurti held a series of dialogues with about 25 psychologists and psychiatrists in New York City. These dialogues were arranged by David Schoenberg, who was himself a psychiatrist practicing in New York City. You may have seen Schoenberg in the videotape series of dialogues with Krishnamurti and David Bohm. That series is called The Transformation of Man. And the transcripts of the dialogues with psychotherapists show a lot of similarities between their work and the work of Krishnamurti. The clinicians, they have some important differences with Krishnamurti, but there are also quite a few similarities. So they had a lot to talk over together over the course of 8 or 10 dialogues spread out over a period of years. Now, none of these dialogues have been edited and published, but I included some excerpts from them in my book in order to illustrate a point, which is that a great deal of Krishnamurti's teaching addresses the actual, concrete, everyday dynamics of psychology. rather than anything that you might think of as religious themes or spiritual or mystical material or um, metaphysical philosophy. He addresses a lot of the same issues that come up in the offices of psychologists and psychotherapists of every variety. That includes issues like fear and anxiety, desire, motivation, loneliness, uh, conflict, both inwardly and outwardly with other people. Now, this might not come as a big surprise to many of you, but what I'm describing is a shift of emphasis because, one of the conventional images of Krishnamurti is that he's kind of a religious philosopher, or some people might even think of him as a guru from India, with all of the associations that go along with that image. And I don't mean to deny that there is a very important religious dimension to the teachings, but I try to show that the main substance and the center of gravity of all his talks and dialogues takes place at a different level, which is the ordinary psychological realities of everyday life. One of the last chapters in my book is called The Mind of Krishnamurti, and here I tried to put together several characteristics that are very unusual or even unique about him as a person, because his authorized biographer, Mary Lutyens, she raised the question, who or what is Krishnamurti? But she had a great deal of difficulty in answering that question, even though she put the question to Krishnamurti directly. And he told her that he couldn't really help her because he said, water can never find out what water is. And so I tried to come at this question from a little different angle, because Krishnamurti had several very unusual characteristics as a person, as a human being. And I tried to put these all together and see what do they say about him collectively. And probably his most unusual characteristic was just the extraordinary philosophy that he discovered and expressed. His philosophy is so comprehensive and detailed and subtle and insightful that it just represents an extraordinary accomplishment. But then you put that together with the very unusual upbringing he had, where it was predicted about him at quite a young age by Annie Besant and the Theosophical Society that he was going to grow up to have this tremendous vision for all of humanity, which it turned out that he did. And so the philosophy plus the prediction represents a pretty unique set of circumstances. And then you couple that with some of the strange experiences he had, like what I described took place a few weeks after he first came to Ojai. And then after that event occurred, he developed another unusual set of symptoms that he called the process. And this consisted of, once again, pain in his head, the back of his head. But the process was also coupled with moments of great bliss and tremendous clarity. And he experienced this process, evidently, for an hour or two almost every day through most of his adult life. And one more ingredient in the mind of Krishnamurti, one more unusual element, is the recorded statement he made at the end of his life. It was his last recorded statement, made about 10 days before he died. It was very brief, just a few minutes long, and in it he describes this tremendous, extraordinary energy that had flowed through him for many years. he says that nobody understood the magnitude of it. And he says it required a very special body and brain just to accommodate so much energy. And so if you take all of these elements together, the last recorded statement and the process and the prediction that was made about him at an early age, and then just his exceptional philosophy, if you take all that together, at the end of it, there's a certain mystery about Krishnamurti, something that is deep and difficult to resolve. And I don't mean to suggest that this affects the meaning of the teachings or the truth of them or our understanding of them, but it does bring into focus that there is something very unusual about Krishnamurti as an individual. Now, after I finished writing the manuscript of my book, I showed it to a couple of people who are very knowledgeable about Krishnamurti in order to try to find out if there were any mistakes, errors of either fact or judgment. And one of the people that I showed the manuscript to was Jaap Sluiter, who's the executive director of the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. And Jaap brought to my attention a dialogue that I had not previously been aware of. I didn't know about it because it has never before been published. But this was a recording that was made in India in 1979. It was mainly a dialogue between Krishnamurti and Pupul Jayakar, who was the main person in charge of his work in India. But there were several other people present and participating, including Mary Zimbalist. And Jaap told me about the recording of this dialogue because in my manuscript I had written that Krishnamurti's process and some of the strange episodes he went through are very difficult to understand. And Jaap suggested I listen to this recording because in it, Pupul Jayakar questions Krishnamurti very closely about these strange episodes and his process. Pupul and her sister Nandini had witnessed one of these episodes in India in 1948. It took place over a period of several consecutive days, and once again it featured a great deal of pain in his head, his neck, his tooth, and sometimes the pain would be so bad that he would faint, and he was only semi-conscious much of the time. And he said a lot of things which were kind of peculiar and difficult to understand. He kept referring to they, and he said they were operating on him, and they knew how much pain he could withstand. So Pupul had taken detailed notes of this episode, and she wrote about it in her biography of Krishnamurti. And in this dialogue, she questions him very closely about what she observed and asks him to help her understand what it was all about. So I came up to the offices of the Krishnamurti Foundation archives to listen to this recording. And it's almost 3 hours long, so I had to come up a couple of times because I was stopping the recording and re-listening to parts of it and taking notes of it. And it is indeed a very interesting dialogue. And so I had to figure out how to incorporate this material in the manuscript of my book. And what I finally decided was, rather than rewriting or adding this new material at various places in my book, I decided instead to just compose a separate postscript, kind of essay, which is several pages long and which just focuses on this one dialogue and summarizes the material in it. And because the dialogue has never been published, I think that some people will find it quite interesting, and I feel like it's a really good addition to my book, and it was very astute of Jaap to bring it to my attention and I'm very grateful for it. Now, I think I should also add a personal note, because some of you might want to know that I was involved myself in some of the events that I had to write about. I was involved in the early years of the Oak Grove School when Krishnamurti was involved, and so I had to describe my own involvement as well. And doing that is a little bit of an uncomfortable thing to do, because, as I said before, I felt a tremendous responsibility to write the story of Krishnamurti's life in a way which is completely accurate and very objective. But having to write about my own involvement, unavoidably introduces kind of a subjective element. And it's still necessary to be very objective, but it adds another layer of difficulty when you're trying to describe your own actions and your own feelings and participation. And so, partly for this reason, I kind of shied away from describing any more about my own involvement than was absolutely necessary for purposes of telling the story of Krishnamurti's life. But after my book was written and published, one of my friends pointed out that actually the personal element, in the form of my own involvement, is one of the things that most people are really most interested to hear about. So I decided to write a kind of supplement to the book in the form of a series of blogs. And I created a new page on Facebook. It's, what you call an author page. It's called Krishnamurti in America. And this Facebook page is mainly for the purpose of posting a series of blogs that describe my own encounters with Krishnamurti and my own direct experiences of him. These blogs are little anecdotes of interactions with Krishnamurti, stories that didn't make it into the book, but which add some color and context to the material in it. And the blog is on my Facebook page called Krishnamurti in America, and you can also find it on my website, which is davidedmundmoody.com. Now, the subtitle of my book is called New Perspectives on the Man and His Message. And the new perspectives are partly a byproduct of the fact that this is the story of Krishnamurti's life in America. And I think it's fair to say that this is the first time that the real and complete story of his life has ever been told, because Krishnamurti didn't really have a home in the ordinary conventional sense, but Ojai is the nearest that he came to having a home. It was the one place where he spent more time by far than any other place after he first came here in 1922. And this is where his relationships with Rosalind and Rajagopal took place. And that interaction was in some ways the central drama of his life. And this is also where he made a home with Mary Zimbalist in Malibu and Ojai for the last 20 years of his life. And he also made a specific point of wanting to come back and be in Ojai at the end of his life. He made it very clear that this is where he wanted to be at the end. So for all these reasons, the story of Krishnamurti's life in America is the best way to get a handle on his life as a whole. And I also feel that looking at his life from the point of view of Ojai in the United States is the best way to get a new perspective on the teachings. It makes it easier to put aside all of the theosophical associations and all of the background of Indian traditions and just take his teachings on their own terms. Krishnamurti urged us to take his teachings at face value and without any associations from the past or any preconceived expectations. And looking at his life from this vantage point, I think tends to facilitate that kind of unbiased, objective examination of what he was trying to communicate. And so I'd just like to conclude by saying again, there are certain things about Krishnamurti personally that are simply mysterious, that we just don't have any answers for. And I feel that the best thing that we can do in that area is just to acknowledge the mystery, try to bring it into focus, say what exactly it is that we don't understand, and what evidence bears upon it. And after that, I think we just have to say, okay, we have taken this inquiry as far as it can go, and then just after that, just leave it at that.
We're live now, David. Welcome. And of course, it's a bit, we have to get used to our Zoom distance, but it's guaranteed virus-free. Of course, we have been, this is our first, you're the first one that we Zoom in from into our meeting. And the people on, the various people watching on YouTube have seen your pre-recorded video, and so we have some questions to you about your book, and we also have several questions from the audience. And I glanced through the first part of the questions, and it seems to be that you put quite a bit of time in the beginning on the whole relationship, the sexual relationship between Krishnamurti and Rosalind, and that's clearly quite a few people. Is it true? Is it not true? What's the evidence? Is it a problem? What is the problem? What are the expectations of Krishnamurti? Is he a holy man? So the holy man. So what have you learned from writing this? Where are you with all this?
Krishnamurti, Rosalind, and Rajagopal, because Rosalind and Rajagopal were legally married. They weren't living together. And as I made clear in my book, Rajagopal had told Rosalind that he didn't want to live with her as man and wife anymore, and he was spending most of his time in Los Angeles while she was still in Ojai. And then she had a child, a newborn, who needed fatherly help, and Krishnamurti was on the premises of the property, and he was perfectly happy to pitch in. And so, it seems as though it all unfolded in a very natural way. And then one other element that is maybe worth noting to some people is that the nature of the interaction between Krishnamurti and Rosalind became part of one of the lawsuits that came about many, many years later in the 1970s and 1980s. And Krishnamurti was asked about it in one of the depositions. And he claimed, and of course this is testimony given under oath, that the sexual aspect of the relationship was initiated by Rosalind, not by him. And so, if people have more specific questions about it, I'd be happy to go into it. But just, looking at it as a general matter, I thought it was important in my book to go into it, to set the record straight, because I think there are quite a few misconceptions out there about it. But at the end of it, I feel like Krishnamurti's behavior was perfectly responsible. My objective was just to put all the facts on the table. My role was as a reporter. And I have a certain point of view, which, probably comes through in the book, which is that I feel like Krishnamurti acted in a perfectly honorable and reasonable manner from beginning to end. But my main objective was just to get all the facts out there in a coherent way, because previously the story had only been told in a partial and disconnected and somewhat distorted way. So that was my first objective. But then beyond that, is there some kind of conflict with the teachings or anything of that nature? So there's two aspects to that question. One aspect is Krishnamurti was very, very clear, don't make any assumptions about the teacher. Take the teachings at face value. They're not spoken from the standpoint of authority, and you don't judge the teachings on the basis of any kind of authority that you attribute to the teacher. The teachings are just there to be explored by the listener and verified on their own. It doesn't depend on your opinions or judgments about Krishnamurti personally. But then, if you want to take it farther and say, well, I do care about the teacher and I do care if there's a discrepancy, again, I feel it's clear there's no discrepancy. He didn't have anything against sect. There's another aspect to this, and that is whether or not Rajagopal was aware of the relationship when it was going on. And Rosalind, in the book that her daughter wrote, made the case that it all came as a huge shock to Rajagopal when he discovered it many years later. But it's very clear by looking at all the facts that that's not the case. Rajagopal clearly knew what was going on from the beginning. So no, I don't see it as a problematical thing, but people have to make up their own minds. My role primarily was as an historian to put all the facts on the table and let people, let the chips fall where they may, according to each person's way they view it and their own assessment.
Maybe.
Yeah, that goes nicely into an audience question we have here. I mean, you touched on it very briefly right at the end of your response there, but this question is, Kay insisted on multiple occasions that there was no relationship between interest in his teachings and particulars of his life. Is this true? How does this serve us beyond idle curiosity and gossip?
It's definitely true. There's no question about it. I mean, it's true. It's just intrinsically true that it has to be the case that the teachings stand on their own merits. You can't judge them on the basis of anything you think about Krishnamurti, because that would be putting him into the role of an authority, which he absolutely rejected. But at the same time, if you ask, well, what is the point of even discussing it at all in the book? The point is the same as anything to do with his life. I wrote a biography of him. Writing a biography of Krishnamurti entails looking at all the aspects of his life, his relationship with his brother, which was hugely important, his business relationship with Rajagopal, which got him, eventually enmeshed in lawsuits. All the people, David Bohm, the theoretical physicist, very interesting relationship. At one level, none of this has any bearing on the validity of the teachings. But on the other hand, it's an absolutely fascinating story because Krishnamurti was an utterly fascinating human being. And the significance of writing about his life, it stands on its own merits. It's not that you need to, know that stuff or resolve any issues in order to have access to the teachings. The teachings stand on their own independent interest. And Krishnamurti's life stands on its own independent interest. That's how I see it.
Yeah, another interesting point that came up, I know you spoke during your presentation when you were sort of presenting what the time was like when Krishnamurti came to California, particularly in Ojai. And this question that we have from the audience is, how did being in America affect or change the teachings? And so I thought maybe we could explore this in the context of, we are saying that the teachings, stand on their own, and you don't necessarily have to have this historian biography approach to go into the teachings, right? But certainly in your experience of examining his life, but also examining his life, as it relates to his time in America, do you feel that there was that there was an influence there, or some part of his biography where his time in America is maybe not essential or required, but still an interesting facet or component of his body of work?
Well, I try to make the case in my book, and this is something I can't prove, but I think there's some evidence to support it, that coming to America was in and of itself a significant part of Krishnamurti's development. First of all, because for so many years he had been just enmeshed in all of the people and rituals and meetings associated with the Theosophical Society. And he said, many years later, he said that none of that affected him deeply, which may be the case. But I feel, and I made the case in my book, that getting away from all that, which is what happened when he came to America, probably tended to facilitate his sense of independence of mind, which was crucial for the development of his teachings. You know, I don't think you could draw a direct correlation between Ojai or America and any particular thing in the teachings, but I do think that the case can be made, and I do make the case that getting away from everything else and coming to a place which was completely new to him facilitated, let's say, his sense of independence from all the things he had been raised in, and the development of, the teaching, which was completely original, as far as I can tell.
So, yes, to take a little bit away from the biographical facts, although we talk about the biography, because somewhere in your book, which is more than a biography, because you're actually also going more into the substance, actually. It's not just a recording of historical facts and some kind of explanation of them. You're somehow also making what I found interesting is the attempt to somehow look for a development in Krishnamurti's teachings, right? That it has changed in certain ways over time. Maybe not as an essence, but in manifestation it changed. Would you be willing to say a little bit more about that? Because that when I was reading the book, that I found the most fascinating part.
This is, for any of Krishnamurti's biographers, this is a tricky thing to get into, because, the man, he lived for the teachings. That was all consuming importance to him. So you really can't write about his life without getting into the teachings. But how you go about it is a tricky thing. Mary Lutyens tried it in a certain way, and Pupal Vijayakar tried it in a certain way. I tried to, as you mentioned, I tried to show that there is a certain evolution and development of the teachings over time. And the way I did that is I took a set of talks from each of several different decades, starting in the 1930s. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And what I tried to do is I tried to summarize using excerpts from the actual talks, but also just summarize what it was that he was saying. So then in that way, without my having to spell it out for the reader that, it changed in this way or this way or this way, the reader can see for themselves how it changed. But beyond that, I think that it is possible to say certain things because, Krishnamurti is very much associated with the notion the observer is the observed, the thinker is the thought. And, those statements really don't appear before World War II in his teachings. He says a few things which kind of hint in that direction, but it does not come out in any sort of succinct or clear sort of way until after World War II. And even then, it's very curious that when it does start to appear in his talks, it appears very tangentially at first, very incidentally. It comes up, in response to a single question, in the 7th of 9 meetings. He first starts to articulate this principle. But then as the years go by, he starts to elaborate and get into it more and more, so that by the time the teachings are in their maturity, it becomes a central theme of many of the talks and series of talks. So that's kind of the way that I try to approach it. There's a question, to what extent did the teachings, I think you mentioned, Yoav, in a way, that there's a question, to what extent did the teachings themselves evolve, or was it a matter of the quality of the expression, the way he framed it? And Krishnamurti himself said at certain times, I believe, he said that the teachings themselves did not really evolve per se, but he learned how to express it better over the years. I'm not sure I agree with that. It looks to me, from having studied it, that certain insights did emerge with the passage of time, especially the one that I mentioned already about the observer is the observed. Also the feature of psychological time. I think the meaning of that and the significance of that grows over the decades.
But you see certain phrases disappearing, like the thought feeling, which was used very frequently in the 30s. I mean, I don't know when it disappeared, but in the later talks, you don't hear that phrase coming anymore.
Right. He does, on occasion, refer to the very, very close relationship between thought and feeling, but putting them together and hyphenating it dropped out.
Do you have any explanation for that? Is that? Do you understand why? I couldn't explain why that was, but do you have a feeling for what was happening there?
No, I really can't explain that. There's another similar thing, during the 1930s, when he refers to the ego, the sense of identity, the I. He calls it the I process. It's hyphenated, I hyphen process. Mm-hmm. That's another one of those little phrases that he used a lot in the early years and which then later dropped away. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think he was always, I think he was very attentive to language and the way people used language. And, I'm not sure that...
It doesn't come along with what I'm trying to aim at is like, if you on one hand say, well, maybe there was also an evolution of the teachings and not only the evolution of language, was the coming and dropping of terms, did that signify a change in his teachings? I mean, I'm not saying that I'm agreeing with it, but just is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think especially with respect to those two particular phrases, I would urge some PhD candidate out there who's doing the research on Krishnamurti to, really go into that and grapple with it. It's a very interesting question. I personally tend to think that it's probably just a change of the way he uses language, of expression, but there could definitely be something deeper to it.
Something that I was curious about is in my presentation earlier. I had found a selection, it was in that compilation, The Individual and Society, it's from another work. Maybe the collected works, I'm not exactly sure, but it's where Krishnamurti proposes, it's in some sort of a small talk discussion, or it's in Ojai, I believe 1948 or 44, somewhere around there, in the 40s, and he's talking about writing thought feelings down.
Yeah.
Sort of watching them come in as they go, and that there's a layer of consciousness that records, and he throws that out there as a sort of a practice, not an established practice, but at least an activity one could do. to sort of slow thought down and begin to just observe without analyzing it or condemning it. And I know in your book you do mention that that was another thing that where later on he kind of put the brakes on that a bit, right? Just in the sense that people were starting to take it too dogmatically or treat it like a ladder of some sort of process, or maybe you could speak more to that.
Yeah, that's a good point, because, Krishnamurti was very against any kind of, anything that he considered mechanical, in the sense of a method or a system to achieve clarity or understanding. Anything mechanical, in his view, predetermined the outcome, and therefore it wasn't free and couldn't bring you to anything true. And so he, assiduously avoided all through his career giving people any particular guidance about, what they should do in order to understand his teachings, with the one exception that you mentioned, which is that for a period of time, shortly after the end of World War II, he had this recommendation that you sit and you try to write down all the thoughts which have occurred to you while you're sitting there, with the understanding that, thought moves very fast. You can't get them all down, but you do what you can to write them down. And, the people who listened to that, they might not have fully understood what he had in mind, because he clarified what the point of this was. It was not just that the activity of writing the thoughts down would in and of itself have some, beneficial effect. What he said was, then you put that aside and you come back to it later in the day or after several days, and you reread what you have written. And when you reread it, then you will observe your reactions coming out. Then you will see how you are judging what your thoughts were and defending some thoughts and condemning other thoughts. And he says that is the real point of the process, is to watch your own reactions coming out when you reread it later. But as you mentioned, after a couple of years, he quit giving this guidance. And I don't have the feeling that it's because he thought it was a bad idea. I think it was because, he got a couple questions from people in the audience. I remember one question, somebody said, okay, last year you recommended writing down all of our thoughts. He says, I've done a lot of that. I've wasted a lot of paper. What's the point? So, and then, that's just a question that happened to get recorded and printed in I think, in the collected works. And, he probably got a lot of other feedback from other people, and so discontinued giving that particular guidance, because it just came too close to being the sort of method. But it's very interesting from a historical standpoint that, if Krishnamurti would ever be tempted into giving any guidance at a particular method, it's very interesting to see what it was that he suggested, right? It was not anything like sitting quietly and repeating a mantra or, I don't know, anything else that you might have associated with some spiritual person. It was this very factual thing of really giving attention to the actual thinking process as it unfolds.
So, can I? You or yeah. So there's a chapter in your book, of course, and you mentioned that about Schoenberg, and I feel it's almost like an area maybe that hasn't been developed very much. Like, what is the potentiality or what is the effect of Krishnamurti on psychology, right? And because Krishnamurti was very strongly about not helping others. And it was not because he didn't want to help. And in these discussions that were organized with Schoenberg, I think they were taking place in New York at the time. And that's a whole series, and the foundation has been republishing them. But it seems to be that he was somehow in this conversation is trying to point at some kind of different way of looking at psychology and at helping, between quotes, or supporting people in need or who are or helping psychology. I mean, could you say something about that? What you've learned by looking at that?
Yeah, those dialogues are very interesting. One of the interesting things that came out in those dialogues was I remember one year that so these dialogues took place in New York City with I think about 25 psychologists and psychiatrists who'd been brought together by David Shainberg, who was himself a psychiatrist. And the clinicians, the psychotherapists, they want to talk about their difficulties in treating people in the office. And after a while, Krishnamurti seemed to get a little bit bored with that, and he said, I can't remember the exact words, so I'm not quoting, but he said something along the lines of, he talked a lot in terms of fragmentation and the fact that the people who come seeking therapy, part of their difficulty is that they are approaching things fragmentarily. And Krishnamurti was recommending, that the psychotherapists themselves in their practice, adopt a more holistic approach. But then he turned it around and he said, can you guys, you therapists, can you help your patients, your clients, look at things more holistically if you yourself are fragmented? So then, he flipped the table on them and turned the conversation around to, what is the state of mind of the therapist? So that was one of the interesting things that came out of it. Another interesting thing to me was, you're right that, Krishnamurti rejected the idea of helping, quote unquote, helping anyone. But, he did see people privately. He didn't call it psychotherapy. He didn't charge for it or, bill insurance companies or anything. But he saw people privately, people who came and told him their personal difficulties. And he responded in a way which was clearly intended to, help people understand themselves or resolve some. And he wrote about these, the commentaries on living. There's 3 volumes of commentaries on living, which are almost exclusively devoted to that. So he himself was engaged in the practice, which I'm sure he would not have wanted to call it therapy. But it's very interesting to read the commentaries on living and see the manner in which he interacted with private individuals who were in some kind of distress in their lives. And he was doing something which I feel could be a great benefit to psychotherapists if they would study it and learn from it.
Because the most famous quote, of course, I think, although it's not an exact quote, but a paraphrase quote of Krishnamurti is, it's not a sign of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. But it does, and his criticism seemed to, in that quote, is that he says adjusting or helping people to adjust in itself is not sufficient, or is not shouldn't be a objective in itself, and I also understand that from these discussions that he wanted to bring in more clearer understanding of the nature of the self, which is in itself is limited, into the whole therapy or the engagement with people who struggled with particular issues, right? Would you agree to that?
You're saying that part of Krishnamurti's approach was to give attention to the nature of oneself, the self-image, the ego, the observer. Absolutely. He had another interesting conversation along the same lines I can't remember what it's called. Maybe you remember. It's the series. I think it might be called The Nature of the Mind, something like that. It's a
Nature of the
series
Mind.
with Sheldrake and one of the participants is John Hidley, who's a psychiatrist, and he brought in the setting of the office of a psychotherapist, and I think they raised that question just in terms very similar to what you described. That they were started off talking about depression, what is the nature of depression, but very quickly moved into just what you're talking about, the sense of self or ego, and how that is, an inherently a self-enclosing, isolating activity, which, then would generate loneliness, depression, all kinds of things.
Yeah, so shifting gears a little bit, but on the subject of your research during, the research period of making this biography, we do have a question here. Did Krishnamurti ever have in-person meetings or correspondence with Rudolf Steiner?
Right, Rudolf Steiner. Okay, I don't have very much to tell you about that, but I can tell you a little. I'll tell you what little I know, and that is that as I understand it, Steiner was at one time part of the Theosophical Society. But when Annie Besant assumed the presidency of the Theosophical Society in 1907, I believe it was, and she made the whole organization kind of shift gears, and she made this notion of a coming world teacher kind of a centerpiece of what the Theosophical Society was all about. And my understanding is that Steiner objected to that. He objected before they even found Krishnamurti and started cultivating him and all the rest. Steiner objected to that and broke away from the Theosophical Society at that time. And that's when he formed his own thing, which he called Anthroposophical Society, which is an interesting similarity with theosophical, right? Anthroposophical means theosophical, theo, is related to the God or divinity, whereas anthro means man, a man-based thing. So that was the kind of different orientation that Steiner wanted to emphasize. But coming back to the particular question you asked, I'm not aware of Krishnamurti ever met Steiner. I don't know, when Steiner died or if he was even around during the time when Krishnamurti grew up and would have been around to talk to him. But it's an interesting question. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, another question we have, which I think is a little bit more in your background, because I know you also wrote that book, Uncommon Collaboration, right, which sort of went into the relationship of David Bohm and Krishnamurti. Question we have here is, why did Bohm and Krishnamurti finish meeting or stop meeting?
Right, that's a very good question. So it's good that you mentioned the book that I wrote prior to this biography is called An Uncommon Collaboration, and it's an entire book devoted to the relationship between Bohm and Krishnamurti. So it's really not fair to say that they stopped communicating. They never stopped communicating. On the other hand, it's also true that the frequency and intensity of their conversations diminished somewhat towards the end, towards the last few years when Krishnamurti was alive. And it wasn't because Bohm lost interest or became skeptical really about Krishnamurti, because Bohm lived for another 6 years after Krishnamurti died, and he continued expressing a philosophy very similar and to what he had discussed with Krishnamurti, and I knew Bohm during those days, and I often discussed with him his attitudes, and he was still very favorable towards Krishnamurti. But it's true that their conversations diminished somewhat in intensity, and there are a lot of factors that entered into that. And it's not possible for me now to go into all of it, but one contributing factor was that Bohm developed a very serious heart condition in 1981. He had triple bypass surgery, and it took quite a while for him to recover from that. But he did continue to have significant dialogues with Krishnamurti right up until the end. I think the last recorded dialogues they had were in 1984 or something like that, just a couple of years before Krishnamurti died. So I'm not going into the whole story. There's quite a bit more to it, but I hesitate to try to describe all of it here. Some of it is a little bit sensitive, and so that's part of the reason why I treated it in the book with great care. I kind of hesitate to summarize it. It's subject to misunderstanding if you don't see all the facts and circumstances.
Maybe you more.
Well, the question I have here more relates back to the topic of therapy, and if there's more to be explored there. So if we want to go that direction.
Yeah.
Okay, this person commented and questioned, as a therapist who found Kay's dialogues with psychotherapists sadly lackluster, I wonder if more of this will be published and critically explored and discussed.
Okay, yeah, Mary Zimbalist made a similar comment about those dialogues, and I think part of the difficulty is that, Krishnamurti was talking with a room full of 25 therapists who, they came from a variety of therapeutic backgrounds. They were not immersed previously in Krishnamurti's teachings. They were just people that David Schoenberg happened to know and thought might be interested. And so therefore the dialogues they're somewhat scattered. The different people keep jumping in and raising points which are a little bit off of what had been discussed. So I feel like those dialogues are very interesting, but in order to really get the full effect of them, they really need to be edited quite a bit by an editor who's skillful both with the language and with understanding the meaning of the material. It's true, if you just read something which is pretty much a raw transcript, it's a little bit hard to bring it into focus, but I think there's a lot of really worthwhile. That's my assessment. I'm not a psychotherapist, so maybe I would feel differently if I were, but I think there's a great deal of very interesting material. There are quite a few of those dialogues that Schoenberg arranged. They did like 2 or 3 a year. I can't remember, 3, 4, 5 different years. So there's a lot of material to go through there.
You were very positive about his experience in America, but one complaint that Krishnamurti expressed was that he felt that he was not used well in California, that he felt stagnant, or he felt he had nobody to interact with. So can you say a little bit more about that, because that seemed to have come through in several publications.
Yeah, I'm aware that he had that complaint. Krishnamurti was not necessarily satisfied with the way his work was received anywhere he went. He was not all that pleased with how his work was received in England or India either. although his complaint may have come out in different form or had a little bit different nuance to it. I think that in Ojai, Ojai is, it's not like being in a major city. And for one reason or another, the trustees, I think he relied upon the trustees to bring him interesting people to talk with. And for whatever reason, they didn't do that to his satisfaction. I think there's another facet to that, and that is that I'm not sure that Krishnamurti's work has been as widely available or as well received in America as it is certainly in India and maybe even in England or France and other countries, which is one of the reasons I wrote my book. I feel like Krishnamurti has not been as well known, certainly not nearly as well known as he should be. The United States might not, I don't know how accessible or how feasible it is for someone with a name like Krishnamurti to really break through as a serious contributor to psychological issues. That name in and of itself, and the fact that he's from India and he, goes around he's not associated with any, university or institution. There's a certain tendency, I think, in the United States to just automatically write off somebody with those characteristics. So I feel like that might have put a damper on the extent to which his work attracted attention of, interesting, prominent people in the United States. But I think, some of it also has to go to the extent to which the trustees were interested and willing to do the spade work necessary to bring people to him. So there's probably a lot of factors, but I would just say again, that he found grounds for complaint of one kind or another almost everywhere he went. So it's not unique to America that he would complain about one thing or another.
We're out of time. It's 1 minute left. Thank you very much, David. I hope if there's anything else shortly you want to say before we close, you can do that now. And
people are welcome to go to my website, davidedmundmoody.com, and leave questions for me. Delighted to hear questions. Or, as I mentioned in my talk, I have a Facebook page now called Krishnamurti in America, and it's another place where people can see the blogs that I'm writing, which kind of supplement my book, and leave comments or questions for me. So, yeah, that would be my only final comment is I welcome hearing from people feedback, questions about any of this material.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for having me.
We're going to have a small break, and then we're going to continue with Professor Krishna in a few seconds. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you so much.